host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Library and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. Please feel free to use this chat to post any question for our guests. To access the chat, please click on the team and instructions. And a quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from the Dr. Victor Fett. Also, he will introduce today's guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Anara. Вітаємо наших слухачів з України глибоким уклоном. Ми є свідками ваших великих страждань, а також вашої великої сили. Дякуємо за участь у нашій щотижневій програмі. I am very glad to introduce today Dr. Alexander MOTYL of Rutgers University in New Jersey. This is his second appearance on our program, which comes a year after he was here with us in September 2022. Dr. MOTYL is a professor of political science at Rutgers, New York, specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory, the author of many books of nonfiction, including Imperial Ends, The Decay, Collapse, and Revival of Empires. He has been an editor of many volumes, including the Holodomor Reader, a contributor of dozens of articles to academic policy journals, newspaper, op-ed pages, and magazines. We are very glad to welcome Dr. MOTYL at this junction in our history. Many new things have been happening since he was here a year ago, and we're eager to hear his comments and analysis. Please, Dr. MOTYL, microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. As before, it's a great honor and a privilege for me to be able to address this audience and share some of my thoughts and analyses of the situation in Ukraine with you. My talk will consist of, three parts with a bunch of tangents, I'm sure. First, I'd like to talk about the actual battleground, a correlation of forces, what is taking place there. Secondly, I'd like to shift the focus from Ukraine to the Kremlin and talk about Putin. And then finally, I'd like to end with a discussion of the larger international context within which the war is being fought and what the implications of changes in that context might be for the war for Ukraine, for Russia. Let me start, as I said, with an assessment of the circumstances on the ground. It's become standard, if not indeed fashionable recently, to say that there's a stalemate and that the stalemate is likely to be permanent. That isn't really the case. And I'll explain why. For starters, that excludes the fact this particular claim focuses only on the battlefront, and it focuses exclusively on territorial gains and losses, which is important, of course. After all, it's the final analysis. If Ukraine wants to liberate the occupied territories, it needs to capture them. But the approach is much too schematic and it fails to see the larger picture. So let me start with some of the larger issues and then work my way down to the actual trenches. One very important achievement, which doesn't get as much acknowledgement as it should, is the fact that Ukraine has managed to drive out the Russian Black Sea Fleet from its key base in Sevastopol in the Crimea. The fleet has now been relocated to the eastern part of the Black Sea, namely to the port of Novorossiysk, and there are plans for basing it in one of the breakaway republics of Georgia. In effect, what this means is that Ukraine has succeeded in liberating is too strong a term, but let's say certainly has succeeded in pushing the Russian Navy out of most of the western and central parts of the Black Sea. When you consider that the Ukrainian Navy consists of a small number of small boats, this is a remarkable achievement. And of course, it's an achievement due to the fact that Ukraine has developed very sophisticated and effective drones, especially sort of like they're submerged under the water drones, which have managed to severely damage and degrade significant parts of the Russian Navy. They've also managed to destroy the 3 or 4 dry docks in Sevastopol, meaning that the port has become useless for larger ships, container ships, and things like that. This is deeply, profoundly significant, especially since Putin has generally regarded the Black Sea as his lake. Well, that's not quite the case anymore. What this also means for Ukraine is that the further away the boats are, the further away the Russian ships are, they can still launch missiles at Ukraine, but it's a longer distance, which means that it's easier, supposedly easier for the Ukrainian air defenses to shoot them down. Where the Russians have a clear advantage is in terms of air power. The Ukrainians they've received some MiG jets. There is constant talk of F-16s being delivered. Thus far, none of that has happened, although Ukrainian pilots are being trained. That said, the reality is that along the front lines, Russia pretty much controls the airspace. Again, Ukrainian pilots occasionally make forays. They bomb certain areas behind the Russian front lines. They've developed a capacity to use helicopters effectively, but none of that changes the fact that Russia maintains superiority in the air and is likely to retain that superiority for the foreseeable future. One of the consequences of this is that many of the claims or the insistence made by Western supporters of Ukraine that Ukraine hasn't made quite the progress that it should be making in terms of the battlefront, in terms of its counteroffensive. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the West is simultaneously insisting that Ukraine have a breakthrough, but is at the same time not providing it with the air power that would enable it to make a breakthrough. So there's somewhat of a vicious circle here. If Ukraine had the resources to balance the Russian presence in the air, it could do what any Western power would do under these circumstances, namely bomb the Russian lines of defense, and only then, after having degraded them significantly, and only after that, embarking on an assault. Instead, Ukrainians are forced to engage in an assault without the requisite air power. What they did, and this brings me to the third point as to the conditions on the ground. What Ukrainians did in May and June at the start of their counteroffensive, they followed Western advice, namely amass tanks and other mechanized units and try to just storm through Russian defenses. That didn't work. The Russians suffered high casualties, but so did the Ukrainians. And that didn't work for a simple reason, as I said, for several reasons. The most simple one being that they lacked the air power. The second one is that since September, October of last year, Russia has managed to build 3 lines of defense, and those are interspersed with fields of mines. It's been calculated that a square meter might have up to 5 mines, so you can well imagine the difficulty that is involved in trying to assault these kinds of trenches and defensive mechanisms. That being said, if one looks at the actual events on the ground, all right, we do see that since Ukraine abandoned the Western advised approach of assaulting the front lines with their mechanized units and their infantry, they abandoned that and they replaced it with a strategy that focuses on incremental gains made by smaller units of soldiers who were given more room and navigability to negotiate the front lines and to strike where the Russians are weak. That's been successful. It hasn't produced any breakthroughs, but of course it's not intended to produce breakthroughs. When you divide your forces into smaller groups and enjoy greater mobility, target Russian forces where they're weakest, well, the best you can hope for, which is exactly what's happened, is incremental advances along a variety of lines. And that's exactly what is in fact taking place. Ukraine is making small movements forward in a variety of sectors. The Russians are defending with greater or lesser degree of success. Most recently, they've been complaining very actively and very energetically in various on social media about the fact that Russian troops are not equipped properly or not led properly, and that they've been suffering enormous casualties. So I take them at their word, since these are Russian sources talking about Russian losses. They've launched a couple of counteroffensives or counterattacks. The most recent one that is still ongoing is in the area of a town called Avdiivka in the east. And just 2 days ago, the Russians amassed huge numbers of troops and mechanized units. And in the course of 1 day, they lost over 800 troops and over 100 tanks and other mechanized units. These are fantastic losses, and they seem to be typical of the losses that the Russians have endured pretty much from the get-go, and certainly within the last few months. Now, Ukrainian losses have also been high. We don't know what they are, nor do we only have estimates of Ukrainian and Russian losses. Ukrainian losses are estimated at being somewhere around 75 to 100,000. We're talking about dead soldiers. Wounded soldiers would be roughly two to three times as many. In contrast, Russian losses appear to be somewhere between 250 and possibly as high as 300,000. And again, by losses, I mean Russian war dead. There are several reasons for thinking that these might be accurate numbers. One is that official Ukrainian statistics put the number of Russian war dead at about 280,000. But it's always assumed that both sides are exaggerating, so that might in fact be the case. More importantly, just a few days ago, an American diplomat at a conference in Belgium apparently stated, semi-publicly, semi-privately, that American estimates are that roughly 300,000 Russians have been killed. And perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence came about 2 weeks ago from Russia's Ministry of Labor and Social Development. It had ordered 230,000 death certificates. Now, it had already ordered some 8,000 in 2022 and another 80,000 in March of this year. So you do the math, divide some of the numbers, add a few others, round them out, and make certain assumptions, namely regarding the extreme unlikelihood that the 40,000 inmates who had fought for the Wagner group are counted in this group. Anyway, you make these sorts of adjustments and you come up with a number that's about 240,000. So 240, 270, 280, 300. We don't know exactly, but it seems like that is roughly where the number of losses that have been suffered by the Russians lies. This is phenomenal. Again, just as a point of comparison, keep in mind that in the 10 or so years of the Afghan war, Soviet losses were something like 13.5 to 14,000 dead. This is, say, 250, 275,000 in the course of 1.5 years. At the rate they're going, there won't be any Russian soldiers left within 8 or 9 years. Anyway, when you look at this picture, right, you look at the Black Sea, you look at the air power, you look at events on the ground, and you begin to see that it's far more dynamic than the image of a stalemate suggests. Ukraine is doing well on the water, not doing as well in the air, and is doing fairly well on the battlefield. The strategy Ukraine is pursuing consists of the following 3 parts. One, of course, is to continue making incremental advances on the front, less so on the eastern and northern fronts. That's where Ukraine is maintaining a defensive position, rather more so on the southern front, where the hope is that they'll be able to break through, or at least move incrementally, and cut the Russian forces in half. They need to get to a number of the cities that are found along the Sea of Azov. If they can manage to cut through that area, then the Russian forces will be divided into that part on the right, in the east and in the north, and that part on the south and in the west. So they're doing this by these incremental advances, but they're also doing this by degrading in very impressive manner the infrastructure, supply lines, and the rest that Russia is employing in order to feed, clothe, and arm its troops in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia provinces in particular. So if you watch the news, or at least if you listen to the, or read the websites, you'll notice that virtually every day there's an explosion, and it's an oil depot, it's a gas depot, it's an ammunition dump, it's a railroad of some kind that has been destroyed. No one particular act is spectacular, but you put them all together and you begin to see that there is a very planned out strategy of degrading these forces. Just yesterday, the Ukrainian special forces and or partisans destroyed a railroad, part of a railroad, and part of a train which was carrying supplies and ammunition. If they can continue doing this, then the idea is that they will eventually cut off, split Russian forces and make them either more demoralized and susceptible to surrender, or more vulnerable and susceptible to attack. And then the third component is, of course, the Crimea. The Ukrainians have been launching, weekly, sometimes more, sometimes twice a week. They've been launching attacks on various sites in Crimea. They've 2 to 3 times already. They've struck the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia with the Crimea. And here the intent is the same. A lot of the supplies that go to the soldiers based in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia provinces, as I said, some of them come north of the Sea of Azov by means of railroad. The majority, however, seems to come across the Kerch Bridge through Crimea, up through the isthmus that connects Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland, and then to the soldiers. So the idea here is fairly obvious: to degrade the Russian military infrastructure and to make supply and to disrupt the supply lines. If you think about this, this strategy makes sense. Frontal assaults simply lead to huge numbers of losses of equipment, but especially of men and women. And a slower, less dramatic approach is likely to be more effective in, if not in the short run, then certainly in the medium and the long term. The problem, of course, is that everybody wants Ukraine, or at least certainly the Western allies want Ukraine to produce something spectacular immediately. And of course, the answer to that is, well, if you want something spectacular, provide Ukraine with longer range missiles, with more tanks, with more ammunition, and of course with the requisite air power, be they renovated MiGs or be they F-16s. So in a way, the West is suffering from a certain degree of bad faith, insisting on results that it's refusing to facilitate, or at least thus far refusing to facilitate. And of course, because of this seeming lack of progress, and I trust and hope you've seen that there has been progress and that there is progress, but in any case, if you accept the dominant version that there's a stalemate, and you project the stalemate into the future, and simply and make the assumption that despite the heavy losses suffered by civilians and military in Ukraine and military on the Russian side, nothing will change in terms of territorial movement. If you make that assumption, then it's not unreasonable to say, well, why don't you negotiate a deal immediately as opposed to waiting 1 or 2 years and negotiating the same deal, because nothing will have changed. Well, again, keep in mind, this logic only works if you truly believe that there is a stalemate. And if, as I've tried to suggest, there is no real stalemate, then the logic falls apart. But the logic falls apart for other reasons as well, regardless of the actual conditions on the ground. And the key reason, the key obstacle to any kind of negotiation, any kind of successful, fair, just, long-term negotiation that would produce some kind of genuine peace is one person, namely Vladimir Putin. He has invested everything. I mean, essentially the future of the country, that is to say Russia, in the war. He's invested the future of his regime in the war. And most importantly, he's invested himself and his own future in the war. As long as Putin remains in power and or as long as he remains alive, it's virtually impossible. Let me go on the limb and simply say it is completely impossible for any kind of negotiated solution to the war. Putin, in addition to being mendacious, in addition to having committed war crimes and having been declared a war criminal by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Putin has effectively set back Russia by decades. Obviously, he's waging a brutal genocidal war in Ukraine. And of course, it's not just a genocidal war, because waging a war and he's also waging a genocide. So there are several things that are going on at the same place. But given his track record, given his mental state, given his physical condition, given the degree to which he has associated himself with the so-called special military operation, nothing will change and nothing can change as long as Putin is in charge. Even if he's not in charge, things will be difficult for a simple reason. One is it's conceivable that whoever succeeds Putin could be on the extreme right, in which case these people would be inclined to intensify the conflict. But as important, regardless of who succeeds Putin, and I'll come to the succession issue in a second, is the fact that, as you know, it was roughly a year ago that the Russian Federation formally, officially annexed Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson provinces. That is to say, these provinces in their entirety, including those parts that are currently in the hands of Ukraine. Technically, officially, constitutionally, all of this territory belongs to the Russian Federation. That's the claim they're making. So that renegotiating, or rather coming up with some kind of negotiated settlement, would entail at the very minimum that Ukraine would retain the territories that it still controls. Of course, the Ukrainian aspirations are significantly more ambitious, but let's just leave those aside for the moment. Given the fact that this is all officially part of the Russian Federation, be it Putin, be it a successor, would have to change the Russian constitution, because at this point in time, there are no provisions in the constitution for de-annexation or secession. Once you're in, you're in. Now, conceivably, that could be done by some others who succeed him, but it will be a complicated procedure, to say the least. Now, I've been referring to the possibility of Putin's successor taking over and facing these circumstances. There are reasons to believe, there are very good reasons to believe that Putin faces serious opposition from significant elements within the Russian economic and especially political elites. These are claims that are made routinely by Russian opposition analysts. They've been made by Bellingcats, Christograzev. They've been made on occasion by Western journalists as well. There seem to be, again, as I said, there seems to be significant opposition to Putin. And of course, that opposition makes perfect sense. I mean, Putin has effectively destroyed Russia, in addition to being actively involved in the destruction of Ukraine. There has been virtually no benefit whatsoever for anybody, and especially the economic and political elites, from the war that he's waging and is incapable of winning at this point in time. So there is opposition makes sense. We saw that first instance of opposition back in June when Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner forces tried to launch a coup and marched on Moscow. In the last minute, he changed his mind or was persuaded to change his mind. We can talk more about that later on. In any case, the response by Putin was very important. He was confused, visibly uncertain, and didn't quite know how to respond. More importantly, the security service, the FSB, the military, and other important sectors of the Russian elite knew about Prigozhin's planned adventure and did absolutely nothing to stop it. Now, they may have had a variety of reasons for not doing anything, but clearly they were not quite concerned with Putin's survival. Had that been the case, they could easily have intervened weeks, if not months, before the coup attempt was launched and nipped it in the bud. Instead, they actually waited to see what would happen. So there is opposition. There are also claims made by a variety of Russian analysts. I present these to you simply as claims that may or may not be unfounded, that Putin is actually very, very ill, and a number of them have actually gone out on the limb and predicted that he will not survive the fall, which would mean that he would be dead by roughly the middle of December, thereabouts. Some have even said that he may not survive October. Well, we'll see whether these predictions are correct, since they happen to be so focused in particular times. But there seems to be agreement, regardless of whether one agrees with these dire prognoses. There is also general agreement amongst many people that Putin isn't quite the man he was physically, that he was several months or several years ago. So the image we get is of a physically declining Putin who may or may not be on the verge of death. A Putin who is also facing opposition within the Russian elites, and that opposition appears to be engaged in sharpening its knives and waiting for the moment. Now, the moment might be waiting for his illness to accelerate, possibly for his death to occur, at which point they would engage in some kind of power struggle. Alternatively, some members of the elite, more likely than not those affiliated with the secret police and the army, might decide to embark on a second coup d'etat. These are realistic possibilities. Again, theoretically and comparatively, if you look at other examples of dictatorships throughout the world, you'll see that bad dictators who make terrible mistakes and who are progressively losing their legitimacy are very often the targets and victims of coups, of successful coups. If anything like this happens, then, as I said just a minute or so ago, a vicious power struggle is likely to break out. At this point in time, there seem to be two groups that are either formed or in the process of being formed, who would be primarily engaged in this power struggle. One are the extreme right-wingers centered on the FSB, the Security Service, the Security Council, and the Army, who believe that Putin is soft on Ukraine, who would want to ramp up the war, introduce immediate mobilization of additional troops, nationalize the properties of key oligarchs, and declare martial law. That seems to be their general plan. The opposition, or at least the key opposition to this, call them the doves, if you like, who are centered on a number of key oligarchs. They are the ones who want to end the war as quickly as possible, introduce reforms at home, possibly engage even in paying reparations to Ukraine. In any case, there seems to be this split. And then, of course, there's a third force, namely the, let's call them the Democrats, the liberals, some of whom, of course, are in jail, most of whom are in exile someplace abroad. At this point in time, they don't look like a major force. But as you know from Russian and other histories, whenever there's a time of troubles, emigres return, prisoners are free, and very often, as in the case of Trotsky and Lenin, they wind up playing very important roles in historical processes. We don't know who's going to win, but we do know that given such a power struggle, the attention of Russian elites and Russian population will be focused primarily on the struggle, on the economic and political chaos, and will be diverted from the war in Ukraine. That's good news for Ukraine, and ultimately it's also good news for Russia, because that means that fewer people on both sides will have to die. What the outcome of this power struggle will be, as I said, we don't know. My own bet is that the conservative, sort of the conservative doves together with the Democrats are likely to prevail, but that may be more my hope than the reality. Whether they'll be able to transform Russia into a flourishing democracy, I'm less certain about that, but we'll see. And we may see these developments taking place within the next few months, within the next half year. Finally, and I'll end on this, as I've already taken up more time than necessary, perhaps, and that is the larger context. And there, the news is somewhat worrisome for Ukraine. Not terribly worrisome, but somewhat worrisome. And so, as you know, recent elections in Slovakia brought to power a man who is friendly with Putin and opposed to continuing aid to Ukraine, namely Robert Fico. And Slovakia has just announced that it's discontinuing aid to Ukraine. That's not terribly important, given that the aid was minimal. That said, it may be a harbinger of things to come. Poland will be holding elections. I believe it's this Sunday. And there again, if the current government remains in power, that's likely to be good news for Ukraine. If the opposition comes into power, well, that may not be the bad news either, because they're more democratically aligned and less, as well as more critical of Russia. But there may be instability, there may be a standoff, there may be a stalemate. Who knows how that'll work out? As you know, there has been talk within the United States of reducing aid to Ukraine. The Republicans have been insisting on this. The Democrats thus far are still supportive of aid to Ukraine, but given the dynamics of the forthcoming elections and of the campaign season, it is certain that Ukraine will be one of the issues that are continually debated. And it's certainly to be, I mean, I'm pretty certain that the Democrats will continue to support Ukraine, even if there is a certain reduction in military assistance. The Democrats are so tied into the Ukrainian cause that they simply can't give it up. And of course, by the same token, many Republicans are so opposed to Democrats and whatever it is that they stand for, that they will continue to oppose aid to Ukraine. How that'll play itself out, I don't know. If Trump wins, all bets are off. If Biden stays in power, then we can expect business as usual. But the trends are somewhat worrisome. I'm not terribly worried, but I'm a little concerned. And then, of course, there is the horrific attack by the terrorists on Israel, and the fact that the war that Israel has declared on Hamas is possibly going to drag on for a while. Here again, no one knows. The war could conceivably end within a few weeks or days. That has been the case in the past with Israel's wars, or at least with some of Israel's wars. On the other hand, worst case scenario, it could extend and to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is located. There is a possibility that Iran might get involved. Anyway, one can spin all sorts of worst case scenarios, and unfortunately, all of them are more than just theoretically possible, they're actually plausible. So depending on how circumstances develop within Israel, that could have, it's hard to say, but it could have an impact on the war in Ukraine. Russia is obviously delighted with Hamas's terrorist activities. It's shed something recently. It hasn't even shed crocodile tears. It's expressed concern and otherwise blamed the war on Israel and the United States, ignoring altogether the terrorist attacks and the massacres and slaughters and crimes against humanity, while at the same time insisting that Ukrainian defensive actions and Alexei Navalny, the Russian oppositionist who is currently in jail, that they are all terrorists. I mean, you know, we are now living in some kind of parallel universe. And just today, you may have read that Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has forbade any kinds of public shows of support for terrorist organizations. And of course, by that, I assume he means Hamas. And of course, paradoxically or ironically, this concern with terrorist organizations doesn't seem to extend to terrorist states such as the Russian Federation. In any case, what does this mean for Ukraine? Well, to some degree, clearly, there will be less attention paid to Ukraine by virtue of the fact that there is now another major crisis on the world stage. You know, regardless of how deeply involved the United States and Europe in the war in Israel, the fact of the matter is there is now another crisis, and the kind of almost exclusive attention that was lavished upon Ukraine will no longer be the case. That will change. Will assistance continue? It seems like the answer to that question is yes. As you probably know, both the Pentagon and the White House have recently said that they will link aid to Ukraine to aid to Israel and put them all in the same package. That's very smart tactically. And of course, it puts Republicans and anybody else in a difficult position where they would have to deny assistance to Israel, and thereby, of course, deny assistance to Ukraine or support Israel and Ukraine. Of course, I trust and hope that Biden had more than just tactics in mind, because ultimately Ukraine and Israel have become something in the nature of brothers by a shared fate. They both face terrorist organizations, terrorist states or organizations that are out to destroy them, that are out to annihilate them. My personal hope is that this will lead to a cementing of relations between Israelis and Ukrainians. Again, it's far too early to say whether that's more than just a theoretical possibility, but it certainly could happen. The silver lining in the cloud for Ukraine, if there is such a thing, considering the atrocities that have been committed in Israel, is that the more the West and the world is concerned with massacres, slaughters, and atrocities of the kind that we've witnessed in Israel over the last few days, perpetrated by Hamas, of course, the more that begins to bring to the forefront the very question of terrorism, the very question of crimes against humanity. And once you talk about Hamas committing these sorts of crimes, it's hard not to conclude that there are other states and other organizations that engage in this kind of behavior. And I, of course, mean the Russian Federation under Mr. Putin. So we'll see. At this point in time, it's far too early to say, because as I said, if the Israeli war lasts a week, then we're back to the, well, sort of the status quo ante. If alternatively it goes on and on, more or less interminably, then we're in a very different world, one that could affect the outcome in Ukraine, or it could be irrelevant. After all, if Putin is removed, if he dies, then we're in a very different set of circumstances, and things that were impossible until then suddenly become possible. And amongst the possibilities, the key one is, of course, the end to the war. So it's not completely inconceivable that next year might see that happening. At the time being, for the time being, let's just pray and hope that the war in Israel ends far sooner than that, and that the war in Ukraine ends sooner as well. I thank you for your attention, and I'd be more than happy to entertain any kind of critical comments, questions. Laudatory comments are welcome as well, but anything would be nice. And I see a hand. I think I see a hand.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. MOTYL. The hand is raised by Dr. Deutsch, our former graduate dean of Marshall University. Please, Dr. Deutsch.
Donald Trump has made the bizarre claim that he could end the war in 24 hours. What do you make of that statement?
Well, I actually wrote a column, making fun of that. Given the fact that these issues are so complicated, given the fact that Putin is incapable of negotiating anything with anyone about anything, the claim that Trump can pull this off in 24 hours simply by meeting with Putin in one room, meeting with Zelensky in another room, and then meeting with both of them in a third room is simply preposterous. That having been said, Trump is a wild card. I can't really imagine that he could pull this off in 24 hours, but he could shake things up. Now, whether shaking things up will be good for Ukraine or good for Russia, that's another issue. But he could conceivably shake them up. But as I said, I wouldn't bet on that. My own beliefs, my own strong belief is that that's just bravado, typical Trumpian bravado. It won't happen, can't happen. It might happen if Putin leaves. If Putin is replaced with somewhat of a moderate or a conservative, or at least a reasonable individual, it's not inconceivable that some kind of tete-a-tete might lead to maybe a peace, a ceasefire, or something like that. Although, of course, if it's a reasonable individual on the Russian side talking to Zelensky, they don't need Trump. They could simply hammer out the details on their own.
I was afraid that what Trump was implying was that he would concede a lot to his friend Putin, who he's described as a genius. So
well, there is that possibility, right? There is that possibility that he would go for the land for peace, well, land for ostensible peace. And, you know, if that's the deal, then Putin would probably agree. But of course, if that's the deal, there's no way that Zelensky would agree. And since that's clear from the get-go, I mean, simply, you know, spending 24 hours with both gentlemen in a cooped-up room doesn't portend any degree of success.
Thank you.
Thank you very
My
much.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from our host, Anara Tebashalieva. Please, Anara.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. And what we can see today, many observers say the Wagner Group prepared Hamas for attack on Israel. It's totally new signature. And probably Wagner trained the Hamas militants. What do you think about links? Or about what do you think about Russia's role in Hamas attacks, and what might be their future prediction? This is my first question. And second question, do you think there are possible transition like Andropov, Gorbachev style in the future or not? Thank you.
Right. Okay, I'm just jotting down some comments. The first question, very interesting. I remember I was listening to a number of Russian commentators on YouTube yesterday, and well, two of them in particular, one of whom, well, I'll leave their names out of the picture, but both of them were certain that the FSB is somehow involved in this conflict. Now, exactly how, they weren't able to specify, but one of them suggested that it's very likely that the Wagner people, as you suggested, were training Hamas. The other one simply used the metaphor that we can be certain that, quote unquote, Russia is pouring oil on the fire. So there is, now the Ukrainians are persuaded that that's the case. Washington claims that there's no evidence. Israel has said that there is, quote, no direct evidence, or rather, excuse me, no evidence of, quote, direct intervention. And I wonder about the choice of that adjective, because, of course, I don't think that anyone is saying that Putin or that Wagner people were involved in the actual terrorist activities. That would be direct involvement. But indirect involvement would entail providing them with some degree of political, financial support, possibly shipping arms. So I personally lean to the view that the Russians had to have been involved in some way. Perfectly possible that they were involved in training elements of Hamas, obviously not the entire military unit. Very, very likely, indeed, probably certain that they, well, of course, we know that they maintain good political and diplomatic ties with Hamas. They have good relations with Syria and Iran. So it's hard for me to imagine that the Russians, whether in the FSB or more generally within the Kremlin, did not have any inkling whatsoever of the planned attacks. I simply can't believe that. They must have known, at the very least, they must have known that these attacks were being planned. They must have known who was doing the planning and who was doing the execution. And at the very least, knowing this, they did absolutely nothing to try to stop it. So in that sense, there is already a certain degree of complicity. But beyond that, as I said, I'd be shocked if the FSB and the GRU and other intelligence services within Russia had absolutely no presence within the Gaza Strip, within Iran, within Syria, and so on, and that they had no inkling whatsoever of what was taking place on the ground. So given all of that, again, it's largely circumstantial evidence. There is no smoking gun yet. But I think the burden of proof, given this, and given Russia's past involvement in the Middle East and in various wars waged by Palestinians, I think the burden of proof is on people who would deny any Russian role. They need to argue why that's implausible, impossible, couldn't have happened, and didn't happen. But as I said, at this point, there is no smoking gun. But there is a lot of, as I said, circumstantial evidence that amounts to a picture that suggests that Russia was somehow involved. Now, in terms of your second question, a transition along the lines of Gorbachev, I think that's actually not impossible. Again, I'm not sure how much money I would wager on it, but I do think it's not impossible. As I suggested, there are these three potential coalitions or groupings that seem to be forming and planning for a post-Putin aftermath. Again, the hardliners, the dovish conservatives, and then the Democrats. In the immediate aftermath of Putin's departure, it's likely that the hardliners will seize power. They have the guns, after all. But at the same time, it's equally likely that there will be resistance on the part of the conservative doves and the Democrats, and that there's likely to be resistance, finally, amongst various elements of the Russian population. I mean, if they institute a mass mobilization, if they declare martial law, if they start nationalizing oligarch assets, they will not only throw the economy into turmoil, Putin has already done that, but they will also aggravate and annoy and alienate a substantial portion of elites and masses. And at some point, Russians will say enough, especially under conditions of a power struggle. When things are uncertain, when coercive institutions aren't as coercive as they usually are, when there are mixed messages, confusion, possibly chaos. And in that sense, I'm somewhat reminded of the late 1980s, where popular discontent was able to manifest itself in the form of the popular movements for the support of perestroika, for a variety of reasons, one being, of course, the Gorbachev support of them, but also because there was increasing confusion and chaos within the political institutions and the political and the state itself. So given this kind of scenario, hardliners who have alienated a significant portion of the elites and masses, a quasi-coalition between conservative doves and Democrats, increasing popular discontent, probably increasing use of violence, both by the hardliners, but also by elements within the population. Within this kind of scenario, well, first of all, anything is possible, obviously, but one of the things that I think is especially possible, and perhaps even more possible than a successful victory, than a victory by the hardliners, would be a victory by the conservative doves and the Democrats. After all, the conservatives control the economy. They will have the support of a significant portion of the political elites, and the Democrats can rely on about 15% of the population that has always despised Putin and his regime and is likely to take to the streets. Under those kinds of circumstances, I could see a kind of, a Gorbachev emerging, maybe from within the conservative dove segment, perhaps an individual within the Democratic camp. It's hard to say, of course, it's impossible to say. But something like that is perfectly plausible. And one can then imagine that in the aftermath of the defeat of the hardliners, these conservatives and Democrats would, of course, be forced to make concessions. So they're unlikely to embark upon 100% Jeffersonian democracy. But they will probably embark on, almost certainly embark on, a loosening of the screws, a weakening of the FSB and of police controls, and a kind of glasnost and perestroika. As to where that will end up, it's hard to say. One hopes, of course, that it will be successful, but I can easily imagine that the effort will be made, and I can even imagine that it might work. Again, we're not talking about a flourishing, democracy, but any movement in that direction would obviously be welcome, and I think possible, which is, again, as important as being welcome. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your answers. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. MOTYL. Do we have any more questions from our guests, please? I had some of my own, but you largely already answered them. Of course, we're close to an hour here, and we will be finishing soon, but I want to give everyone a chance to ask a question. Nobody asked a long-ranging question of possible disintegration of Russian Federation, but I think this goes even into more hypothetical area. It has been circulating a lot within many Russian opposition venues. Maybe you can briefly comment on the...
Well, it's, 2-3 years ago, that kind of scenario would have been dismissed automatically. And I think probably justifiably. And now, this isn't just a theoretical possibility anymore. It could actually happen. And the reason is very simple. Putin is the center, the core of the political system he's created. I call that system fascist, but one can call it authoritarian or something else. It doesn't matter. If and when Putin departs, and we can be certain that he will at some point depart, but let's assume he departs within the next year or so, then that means it will be very hard for his successors to maintain the system of which he was the core. I'm not saying that they will then simply fall apart, but as you may recall, I was just talking about these various power struggles. As these power struggles are taking place, as possibly the conservatives and the Democrats win, who knows, right? It'll be hard to sustain that degree of authoritarianism. It is also very likely that under those sorts of politically chaotic conditions, economic growth will continue to decline, economic difficulties will increase, and so on. Under that kind of general scenario, put yourself in the position of a Chechen leader who has access to 10,000 troops. Put yourself in the position of a Buryat leader who knows that a very large percentage of the dead Russian soldiers are Buryats, and so on. Go down the list. And it's perfectly possible that they will respond to these conditions in the same manner that the republics and autonomous republics did in 1989, 90, 91, and 92. We can see, once again, one of these parades of sovereignties. And it will be very hard for the Russian Federation to maintain control over all of them. What's necessary is for one republic or one region to start the ball rolling. My own bet would be on the Chechen, on the Ingush, or the Dagestanis. They've been troublemakers all the time. They have the resources, they're angry, they're far away. But if they succeed, then it's not inconceivable that that could be repeated in other places as well. Now, how will that end? I don't know, right? But it could end in the disintegration of a significant portion, maybe not the entire federation, but certainly a significant portion. My own sense is that if that happens, it's likely to be peaceful, or more peaceful, rather more peaceful than violent, because as in 1991, the autonomous republics have a certain political infrastructure in place. They have a certain kind of legal structure in place, as did the republics in 1990 and 1991. So it's conceivable that it will be, that they'll simply depart and we'll leave it at that. But of course, the ball will be in Russia's court, because if Russia then redeploys its troops from the Ukrainian front and then tries to recapture some of these places, that could obviously lead, well, conceivably to civil war. At that point, as I said before, all bets are off. So, at this point, the speculations become not just speculative, but extremely speculative to the point of being almost phantasmagoric.
Thank you very much, Dr. MOTYL. I will ask one more time if our guests have any questions. And if they do not, as I see, we all will thank you profoundly for a brilliant analysis, which we all need to hear these days. Thank you for being with us. And we will conclude our 85th meeting of MUkraine discussion group. Right now, I will say a couple of words in my accented Ukrainian to our viewers in Ukraine. Дорогі брати і сестри в Україні, ми тримаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог береже вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня ми прощаємось. Слава Україні! Glory to Ukraine!
Heroin Slava!
God bless
Heroin
us.
Slava.
Heroin Slava. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fett, for inviting me, and thank you to your colleagues for listening and for the questions, and thanks as well to your larger audience. It's always a pleasure, and it's always an honor to speak to such a distinguished group of scholars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.